Okay, so this is the exciting moment of pretty much the first presentation of on my book, which is going to be published this week. You can see I'm a bit nervous and excited. The title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. And I think that this book has a timeliness that I could not anticipate when I started working on this topic a couple of years ago. Sadly, in the context of the so-called New Cold War, the question of how did we come to this point has become really a pertinent one. And I think that understanding how China's rise came about and understanding the economics of China's rise, but also understanding why the end of history in China did not mean the end of a state-led kind of development is important for understanding why we are where we are today. So this just as a quick preface. I think we can think of the 1980s as a crossroads in the global economy. In many ways, this is the beginning of China's economic convergence, or what looks more and more like an economic convergence with the West. But this economic convergence, in terms of increasing economic prosperity, did not come along with an institutional assimilation. So China has integrated deeply into the global economy, but has not institutionally assimilated in a wholesale fashion with the institutions of economic governance in Europe and the United States. At the same time, the 1980s mark the beginning of a new great divergence, if you want so, between Russia's fall and China's rise that can be linked to a difference in approach to market reforms. Both giants of communism of the 20th century underwent substantive marketization, but they did so under very different premises in a very different fashion, and the outcomes couldn't be more different. I think it's also worthwhile taking a step back and looking at why the 1980s is just so important, also from a more historical perspective. And one way of doing this, which is of course a very crude and ad hoc fashion, but nevertheless, I think it tells us something, is to look at the development of world shares in GDP by regions or countries. And in this case here, I'm focusing on China's share in world GDP, which is here shown in purple. So we can see that in 1820, China still accounted for about 1/3 of world GDP. By the time of the revolution in 1950, after decades of war and destitution, China had become one of the poorest countries in the world and had its share in world GDP had shrunk to 5%, and is now rising back. In 2008, it was around 17%. So we can very clearly see that in 1980, China was still roughly at a similar share of world GDP as it was around the time of the revolution, and that since the 1980s, China has been re-emerging in the world economic system. So this is another reason why I think it's important to take the 1980s as a turning point seriously. So if I say that China's rise and Russia's fall is linked to the different approaches to marketization, not arguing that it can be reduced to economic policy, but I do think that economic policy choices were important in the outcomes that we have observed. So Russia's main policy choice can be summarized under the label shock therapy, which was thought of as a package reform that was comprised of price liberalization, macroeconomic austerity to control the general price level, where price liberalization was really thought of as the shocking element in shock therapy, the element that could be implemented overnight. So this was combined with austerity, the big bang, the initial big bang towards shock therapy. Thirdly, trade should be liberalized and private assets should be privatized. Sorry, public assets should be privatized. If we look at the outcome of shock therapy in only a very simple way, which is to look at the outcome in terms of price stability and real GDP, we can see that this is on a logarithmic scale, that basically after 1990, inflation went through the roof. So we cannot even plot this on a non-logarithmic scale, because otherwise we would be plotting to the top of the roof, depending on what kind of building you are sitting in right now, but chances are that you will be landing somewhere outside of the building. Whereas the dramatic decline in GDP here looks actually less dramatic than it was because inflation is just so rampant in this period. So we have a picture of prices going completely out of control, whereas GDP collapsed in a fashion that was more dramatic and more long-lasting than the Great Depression in the United States. In contrast, in China, we see that pretty much throughout the reform period and pretty much until today, inflation, which is here in black, has, with one exception in the mid-1980s, always been lower than GDP growth, whereas GDP growth has been on this pretty steady path, with an exception of 1990, which I will get to in the course of my talk. So we really see the reverse image in terms of Russia and China, where in one case, inflation exploded and GDP collapsed. And in the other case, GDP grew very fast and steadily, and inflation was by far and large under control. Another way of looking at this is to look at the average income, real income per adult by population quantiles. And if you just focus on the top, the second line from the top, which is the bottom 99%, the famous 99%, you can see that in Russia, which is here plotted in red, I mean, first of all, GDP, real GDP per adult collapsed overall, but also the real income per adult in 2015 was still below what it had been in 1991. Whereas in contrast, China, of course, experienced rising inequality and very severely rising inequality. However, we also observe a steady growth in the income of the 99%. So again, a drastic contrast in terms of the outcome of marketization. Okay, if Russia pursued shock therapy, then we can summarize China's approach to reform as a gradualist dual-track approach to marketization. This is well known and well established, but the standard analysis of China's reform politics is typically framed in terms of reformers versus conservatives and overlooks the fierce debate among reform economists over how to reform. So there's an assumption that the question was only whether or not to marketize, and that once you marketize, once you go to capitalism, it's pretty much all the same. So all that we should care about in the standard account will be when China moved from pursuing communism to pursuing capitalism. However, I think what my research shows is that the question of how to marketize matters dramatically in terms of the outcomes of reform, and in some sense shifts our analysis, shifts our focus to a different dimension. So in my book, I try to provide a systematic assessment of China's path-breaking debate over market creation at the 1980s crossroads, which I hope I've just illustrated to you as being a crossroads, not only for China, but really in world economic history. So in order to understand the beginning of reform, I think it's worth taking a step back and reminding ourselves of the ambition of the revolution. The revolution was, of course, about much more than economic progress. There can be no doubt about it. But it was also about economic progress. So the People's Daily editorial on October 2nd, 1949, reported that, quote, the ambition of the revolution was, quote, to gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one. So this was part of the ambition in 1949 when the communists won the civil war against the nationalists. China was emerging from decades of civil war, hyperinflation, and really a complete disintegration of the economy as such. When Mao died in 1976, China had of course gone through one of human history's worst famine and all of that. It had also achieved basic industrialization and quite substantial progress in public health. one of the World Bank officials whom I've interviewed for the book was saying that when they toured China in 1980, they saw poverty and they saw severe poverty, but it would not have been the kind of ugly face of poverty that wouldn't let you sleep in your hotel at night. So we can see that there was achievement in overcoming the ugliest aspects of poverty. Nevertheless, China was still, if you want to use that language, a backward agricultural country. By 1980, China's GDP per capita was still less than that of Haiti and Sudan, just to illustrate what the starting point was. So after Mao's death, the designated Herr Huagofeng took over, and he basically attempted another big push industrialization. This time, this big push industrialization was meant to be fueled with foreign technology and financed with petroleum findings. These petroleum findings did not come forth as they were projected. So this model very quickly ran into very severe difficulties. But one thing that Huagofeng did with his attempt to achieve big push industrialization through foreign technology was an opening up of China to the world, in the sense of sending numerous delegations around the world to tour more advanced countries and understand how economic progress had been achieved there. In the context of this touring of foreign countries, there was a great sense of disillusionment and a great sense of just how backward China was in the late 1970s. So, for example, Deng Lizun, who's an important reform leader who was part of such a delegation, is reported to say that in talking about his visits to foreign countries, he sighed with emotion that the Western countries were now prosperous, rich, civilized, and polite, but there's no sign of revolution at all. So there was a clear sense of China had fallen behind drastically, whereas the idea of finding some sort of revolutionary alliances abroad was really as dead as it could have been. So in this context, Deng Xiaoping elevates economic progress as the most important aspect of China's overall project. So China's overarching goals are now to rid the country of poverty and backwardness, to catch up with or even surpass the advanced countries. Not only the comparison with countries in the West and countries abroad was devastating for China's reform leaders, but also the fact that within China itself, the signs of poverty were still severe. So, for example, Chen Yun, who was the architect of economic reforms in the early years in particular, he was really the person in charge of economic policy making on the side of Deng Xiaoping. Later, there's a split between Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun and all of that. But in these early years, he was the figurehead, there can be little doubt. So he's saying in 1978 at the crucial Communist Party World Conference that, quote, "It has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If this problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food." Okay, so in this context of the realization that China had fallen even further behind, and at the same time, poverty and backwardness really using here the language of these leaders themselves, was continued to be a very severe, not only economic, but also political problem. China is attempting reform and is attempting to overhaul its economic system in the name of economic development. In this context, very early on, Deng Xiaoping already acknowledges that markets are incredibly important for this project of reform. So Deng Xiaoping says to an Italian journalist in 1979, saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? But the big question is how to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy, into a planned economy that previously was not organized through market mechanisms. So this is the question that I'm focusing on in the book, which is really the question of how to create markets starting from an economy that is largely not organized through markets as the primary coordinating mechanism of the economy. And in this context, we also have to remember that during the Cultural Revolution, economics was pretty much banned in China. Economists were banned to the countryside. They had the economic research institutions were shut down and so on. So there was no strong starting point in terms of economic research that could have immediately informed these debates. So Deng Xiaoping, for example, in 1980, in a speech on the present situation and the task before us, is saying, a good number of comrades who were shunted aside for many years and haven't been back in their original post for very long have lost touch with the situation. Even those who stayed at their posts all through are confronted with new problems they find hard to grasp immediately. So on the one hand, Deng Xiaoping, in the name of elevating economic progress to the most important goal, switches from the Cultural Revolution idea of politics in command to economics in command, but at the same time, economics itself is very much in a crisis. Okay, so in this broad context of an urge for reform, shattered economics discipline, and increasing engagement with the Western world, both through political delegations, but also through intellectual exchanges, two reform paradigms emerge. The first one is what I'm calling here the dual track market reforms, which was an alliance of young reform intellectuals who had spent their youth in the countryside, being sent to the villages during the Cultural Revolution, and often spent from their teens to their mid-20s in the villages, and who then returned to the cities in the late 1970s as Deng Xiaoping reopens the university entrance examinations, and they enter into universities. And they kind of build this movement of young intellectuals who, because of their experience in the countryside, are dedicated to the question of agricultural development and try to be part of this moment of reform, of this moment of a change in course in China. And they form a strong alliance with an older generation of leaders, really through the agricultural reforms. Their educational background was, broadly speaking, that they were self-trained in Marxist classics. So while they were in the countryside, they revisited Marxist classics, including Lenin's writings on state capitalism, on tax in kind and all of that, but also Mao's writings. And in the late 1970s and early 80s, they start to engage very broadly with Western social sciences, starting to translate Max Weber and so on. So they really like catch up, if you want so, with the Western social sciences of the 20th century, primarily motivated by a dedication to the political economy of agriculture. Their intellectual inspiration in many ways comes from empirical studies in China. So they really come from these hands-on problems in terms of how can we achieve agricultural development. And later on, they also start to organize tours in other countries, including Hungary, Yugoslavia, as well as Brazil, actually, which I haven't listed here, but also post-war West Germany, because West Germany had been an important reference point in terms of price reforms, and I'll get to that later. Okay, so these people basically, as this moment of the early reforms was taking place, and as certain on-the-ground experimentations were more or less spontaneously emerging in various places, these young reform intellectuals played an important role in serving experimentations that were happening on the ground, and that led to the emergence of a dual track system in the agricultural economy, which I will get to in a moment. Since this beginning of reform really comes out of the agricultural political economy, I think it's worth taking a step back and connecting this to a very long-standing tradition of institutions in China of regulating agricultural prices and markets. My point in the book is not to draw a straight line from ancient China to today and to say, okay, this is all like Chinese essentialism, and if we only had Confucius in Russia, then things were different. That's not the point, okay? But the point is that just as we do in the Western context all the time, that we take institutions that have a very long life seriously and take them into account in the ways in which we think about development. And in China, there is a very strong tradition around the regulation of grain production. In particular, there is the institution of the ever normal granary, which were public granaries and which were regulated based on the principle to stabilize prices across the agricultural cycle. So these public granaries would be buying grain at harvest time when there was an oversupply of grain, and would be selling grain just before harvest when there was an undersupply of grain, and thereby both extracting revenue because they were buying cheaper than they were selling, but at the same time, with this counter-cyclical intervention, really stabilizing the agricultural cycle. Now, what is important here is that there was a sense of controlling what is heavy and thereby also controlling what is light, where the idea is that if you are in an agricultural economy and you control the price of grain, you effectively control the overall price level because grain is just so important. So by stabilizing the grain price, you actually stabilize the price level overall. So therefore, inherent in this logic of the ever normal granary that we can trace back to ancient times to texts like the Guanzhen around 300 BC, there is a very clear distinction of governing by focusing on controlling what is heavy or important and letting go of what is light or not as important. Okay, another dimension to this is that economic policy requires very careful empirical assessment of concrete dynamics. You have to understand where exactly in the agricultural cycle you are in order to release grains or not release grains. And therefore, there's a strong empirical, if you want to use that traditional distinction in macroeconomics of discretion versus rules, there's a very strong sense of needing discretion to understand the concrete empirical conditions in order to be able to adjust your policies accordingly. Now, this ever normal granary system has been existing really over millennia, and I think that there is a certain economic policy principle ingrained in it that also pertains to a specific kind of state-market relations, where there's no clear distinction between the state and the market, because the state entity, which is a public granary, is actually acting as a market participant and at times even as a market creator. When there's no demand for grain, the state creates demand for grain. And these public granaries would actually also balance across regions. So as such, it would also create a market that would break out of the local market and actually create an integrating market mechanism across otherwise not integrated regions. So I think we can think of the ever normal granary system as a logic of state market participation and state market creation. And this logic that is not based on the idea of a separation between state and market and a separation of a state that intervenes into an economy, but a state that actually creates and participates in that economy, I think is something that is as a very basic logic that is showing up in the 1980s in the context of the agricultural reforms. Now, this very same logic, in fact, was also absolutely crucial in the 1940s and 1950s when the communists were fighting against the nationalists in the so-called War of Liberation, since stabilizing prices was absolutely crucial in gaining economic ground in the revolutionary struggles. And in this context, Chen Yun, in 1950, after the revolution, when they are using similar techniques of basically using state commercial agencies to reintegrate markets and thereby stabilize prices, made this statement that goes, quote, "Rising prices are not good, falling prices too are not good for production. It is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily." Now, this second part of this quote, "it is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily," has emerged as one of the most famous slogans of economic reform of the 1980s, and is often in the analysis of China's China's marketization seen as the metaphor that encapsulates China's economic reform approach. Now, what I'm pointing out here is that this really goes back to these practices of price stabilization in the 1940s and 50s, which are inherently connected to the practices of the ever normal granary. Okay, so this is just for background, like where I see the deeper roots of the agricultural reforms coming from, and therefore the deeper roots of China's marketization approach. More concretely, the agricultural reforms in the late, so I'm now back to the late 1970s. This was just, what I just said was just to kind of give you some broad institutional historical backgrounds of modes of market creation in the Chinese context. Now, more concretely, if we think about the agricultural reform, we can very schematically think of the starting point of reform as one where each commune, which I've here depicted in these triangular shapes, would be delivering a grain quota at a state set price to some higher up authorities, and would in return get a certain amount of money. But this price was always set such that there was a net extraction from the communes to the urban industrial economy. So there was a redistribution from the countryside to the urban industrial economy. Now, agricultural reform basically meant that the localities maintained their commitment of delivering a grain quota and getting a state set price in return, but that the production of this grain was no longer organized through the commune, but would now be contracted down to the households. So every household would have to deliver their share in agricultural production. And if they managed to produce more than their share in the quota, they could sell this share in the market. Now, starting from a situation where there were no larger markets to begin with, locally, of course, you could have small markets emerging, but for market links between communes or between the countryside and the urban industrial economy, state commerce again played an important role in even creating these markets for agricultural reforms. Okay, so this was the logic of agricultural reforms that emerged at the time, and these young reform intellectuals I've been referring to basically researched how this came about spontaneously, more or less, and then have helped to translate this into national policy. The bigger question in the economic reform debate was how to go about reforming the urban industrial economy. The agricultural reforms turned out to be an overwhelming success very quickly, increasing agriculture output very quickly. But the question was then, how can we move with reform into that part of the economy that before reform was organized based on the ideal of one big national workshop, where you would have a set of, which I'm just summarizing here as central command authorities, that would in a very idealized fashion here basically command outputs from each production unit, where each production unit would be delivering their output to the next production unit, which would be the assigned inputs for this next production unit. And the prices between those production units would be pretty much set by the central command authorities. Now, this whole system was organized in a way that heavy industry and basic industrial goods would be priced below cost, whereas so-called luxury goods, which at the time were things like bicycles, wristwatches, or radios, would be priced above cost, so that you actually had a redistribution across sectors, and that you could use the selling of luxury goods to extract liquidity from the system. Okay, so these prices are very consciously not set as prices that are meant to guide the decision making of each of these production units, but they were set as a tool of redistribution across this national, so-called national workshop, which of course was not completely monolithic in the way in which I'm depicting this here. So then the question became, how do you introduce market mechanisms into such a system? Okay, how do you start with markets if this is your starting point? What basically happened is, if you think about it, if the agricultural reforms meant that rural households started to produce more than the quota, and they started to actually engage in market activities that went beyond the plan. And for these market activities, they wanted in return to have certain consumption goods, or maybe also production goods. If they started to say, like, start a little township and village enterprise, then there was some sort of a demand pull dynamic, because the production of industry goods was predominantly located in the urban sphere. So you would quite spontaneously get a dynamic where if each of these production units could produce more than they produced under the plan, they would start to cater to these markets that were emerging. So initially, this was basically something that was more or less tolerated, and then more or less encouraged for goods that were further downstream. But the big question became, could you apply this same kind of logic also to the very upstream industries, such as coal, electricity, steel, copper, and so on? And in fact, this group that I've sketched to you was arguing that basically this dual track system could be applied also to the more upstream industries, where these upstream production units would now be contracting output to the central command authorities. If they were able to produce more than that, then they could cater to the market, so that you would have more than one price for every good, depending on whether it was a market price or a planned price. Okay, in the interest of time, I skip over this, but I'm happy to talk more about these concrete stories about conferences and all of that. And I'll skip over to the second group, which I'm labeling here as the package price reform group, which was why this agricultural reform was happening and all these concrete reforms were taking shape. The economics discipline was kind of being re-established, was kind of reinventing itself in dialogue with Western and also Eastern counterparts. So this was really a group of middle-aged established intellectuals and some young academics who often came with an engineering or science background. The middle-aged established economists often had very orthodox socialist training in economics in the 1950s, after the revolution. They were the first to study modern economics in the United States and England. Here, for example, Wu Jinglian, who takes a pride of 1983 being one of the very early people to have been sent to Yale to study economics and study with Montias comparative economic systems, but also took classes in like Econ 101 at Yale at the time. They engaged with the socialist calculation debate and all these questions of the possibility of a rational socialist economy, and engaged in particular also in in-depth exchanges with Eastern European emigre economists such as Bruce Schick, who is considered the economic architect of the Prague Spring, Janos Kornai and others, but also monetarists like Milton Friedman, Gregory Chow, and so on. And one of the important metaphors that emerges in this discourse is the idea of the so-called Erhard Miracle, which was the idea that basically by liberalizing prices overnight, you could more or less overnight produce market prices and thereby produce a market economy, and therefore could successfully transition to the market pretty much with one big leap. Okay, this is just another World Bank conference that I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A, but let me go back to the logic of these two perspectives. So the second group, coming from this, if you want, so Walrasian idea of one rational set of prices, were terrified by the idea of having multiple prices for one and the same good, coming out of one and the same production unit, and basically argued that this system of multi-tier pricing created massive friction and contradiction in the system, and was in some sense more irrational than what had happened before, and therefore would have to be overcome as quickly as possible. Towards the late 1980s, they then also start to invoke the Virginia School type of logic of rent seeking and corruption and say, well, if you have one production unit that is selling at two prices, where one price is very high and the other one is lower, then the officials who are in charge and who have command over these precious commodities will be prone to corruption, which is of course true, and which of course also happened towards the late 1980s. But the question becomes, would liberalizing all prices create a less corrupt situation? Because then you would basically have a complete command over these goods on the part of the officials in charge. Okay, so these people are basically arguing that what you would need to do is to impose tight fiscal and more monetary control. So this is basically your austerity in the language of shock therapy. Then there should be an intermediate step where you use calculation and you calculate the equilibrium prices. You adjust all prices for once to where they should be. And since you then have prices in the right place, you can let go of prices and have basically your wonderful, perfect market economy if you let go of prices in one big bang. Now, the core of the question was really not about these downstream industries, was not about the prices that were overpriced under the old system, but the core of the question was whether or not to let go of the prices of the commanding heights of the industrial economy. And the dual track group was basically arguing that such a big bang would not solve the price problem, would not establish functioning markets, but would instead create cost push inflation because the prices of these upstream goods were underpriced to begin with. So if you let go of them, they will shoot up. Now, if they shoot up and all of these production units are now catering to so-called market prices, but have never grown into the market, therefore, they would just hand down the price increase to the next production unit. So what you would get is an upward spiral in wages and prices without an adjustment of the relative prices and quantities. So they were arguing that instead, the dual track system would have to continue, corruption would have to be brought under control by other means, but the dual track system would allow these entities to actually grow into the market and become market-oriented enterprises and therefore eventually become functioning entities, whereas it would allow the state to continue to control the upstream industries more tightly, which were the crucial industries for the industrialization project, instead of risking for them to collapse under hyperinflation and chaos. Okay. So the big question was whether or not to keep control of the industrial core, letting go of prices of inessential consumer goods, especially highly profitable goods that were already in surplus at the time, was less controversial. So this is really about the question of the state-market relation at the core of the industrial economy in the most upstream industries, in the industries that are most crucial for the industrialization project. 1986, China almost implemented a big bang of the type that I've just outlined to you, but there was a delegation that went to Hungary and Yugoslavia, financed by George Soros, whom some of you might recognize in the picture down here, that sent back telegrams warning along the lines as I've just depicted against such a big bang liberalization, since in Hungary and Yugoslavia, they had undertaken experiments with price liberalizations, reforms, and had experienced inflationary episodes in that context. And through their interviews, they actually had gained information that this was, confirmation of their initial hesitation towards this approach, and basically sent back telegrams warning, and this approach was stopped. 1988, there was another attempt at such a big bang. This time, the overall reform project had kind of reached a deadlock where it had become clear that not everybody stood to gain from reform and marketization. The political and social tensions were mounting, and Deng Xiaoping got anxious to secure his reform project. So he kind of thought, why not cut the Gordian knot in one fell swoop of the knife, if one could. So he started to lobby for such a big bang. And just to bore you with one quote here from, ironically, June 4th, 1988. We all know what happened 1 year later on June 4th, where Deng Xiaoping is saying, long-term pain is worse than short-term pain, which is basically the key slogan of shock therapy, right? Where the idea is you have to impose short, severe pain in order to lay the foundations for long-term prosperity. On state TV, comprehensive price reforms were being announced on August 18, 1988, and these announcements were enough to unleash the first very high inflationary episode in China since the revolution, which then resulted in a turnaround, sudden stop to these reforms, and then eventually a losing of control over economic policy momentarily on the part of the reformers. This is important background to what happened in 1989, which of course was predominantly political, but still is in the context of this meltdown in 1988. But even though there was this turnaround, I think it's important to acknowledge that by the time that Deng Xiaoping restarted reforms in 1992, the logic of dual track gradual market creation through the state had been so thoroughly established that even though there were a number of radical reforms, the core of the system continued to be organized in that fashion. Okay, in 1988, we also get a reappearance of Milton Friedman, who once more promotes his approach to reform. But by the time that Milton Friedman comes to China, the political window for such a push through really has closed. Okay, so in conclusion, the logic of the Big Bang is one that starts from comparative statics, an idealized model of the old system, in a theoretically derived target model, which reforms should achieve in one shock transition. So the idea here is to create complete markets with free prices as the target of reform. And this is meant to be achieved by destroying the planned the plan and destroying the relations of command and order in the planned economy. In contrast, the logic of the dual track system is one that starts from an analysis of the prevailing economic forces and institutions to identify ways to create reform dynamics at the margins and re-industrialize without undermining social stability. Market forces are here seen as a means in a larger transformation process, and these market forces have to be unleashed, guided, and steered by the state instead of simply being led to their own devices. So why was China's policy choice not the Big Bang, but the dual track? Leaders were not prepared to risk the survival of the communist state and endanger their vision for long-term development in the end. The Big Bang seemed to promise a scientific solution to economic system reform, yet it was found not to create a viable market economy, while at the same time risking the stability of the core of the plan. The dual track system gradually emerged as a policy alternative throughout the 1980s, and through the experimental reliance on techniques of market creation by the state, distinguishing between essential and inessential goods, and relying on a systematic assessment of the concrete economic conditions and dynamics. So what are the implications of China's escape from shock therapy? The two reform approaches have continued to compete in China's debate. So after the 1980s, this debate was in some sense not over. We hear references to unfinished reforms in China until today, which is in some sense still this question of whether to complete marketization in the sense of shock therapy or not. The question of whether China is a market economy also continues to be controversial. Secondly, as a result of China's distinctive path of reform, which I've tried to sketch the origins of, and through decades of experimentation, China has created what I think we can think of as a new kind of economic system that requires being studied in its own right. Finally, China's re-industrialization that has been facilitated by this strong state steering of the core of the economy has enabled China to develop its own full-fledged economy in the sense of having all sectors from upstream to downstream within their own national economy, and has facilitated China to gradually move towards competitiveness in sectors that are closer to the technological frontier, which I think is important to take into account when we try to understand the mounting tensions in the global economy. gone a little bit over time. My apologies for that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Isabella. That was a fascinating talk. So I'm extremely pleased we had the chance to hear that and to have this first introduction to a very rich book. And I will just raise a couple of points because I think it would be very interesting to get your perspective on that. And then Olga will have a set of questions as well, and we will collect in the meanwhile. You address the main set of questions, some further suggestions, comments from the audience. One of the things that strikes me is this, you were referring to Deng Xiaoping, sense why can socialists practice market economics, right? I think it raised a fundamental question around how we understand market. What was in his mind, the concept of the market, right? So if it was, in a neoclassical sense, the main price coordination information a la Hayek, right? Is where the knowledge and the coordination mechanism is going to be. Or in fact, if it was more related to how to create, unleash competitive dynamics that potentially can reduce the risk of rentieristic position or block some dynamism in terms of innovation, in terms of further activities. So the first question for me is really, from your very detailed analysis of how they were talking about markets in a country where the market was not there yet developed in the traditional sense, right? What was their conceptualization of the market and how much was or not matching the more neoclassical standard Western idea of the market as was emerging out of the more orthodoxy in the US, in the UK, and in other countries. The second point that I had was, this is more very much probably something that I don't know if you've looked at, but this problem of, you stressed a lot in your presentation about the agricultural reforms, right? As a sort of also constitutive moment for an intelligentsia or a group of people in the country to engage with the reality of the structural problems in the economy. But we know very well that this was in the 20s, 30s. We go back to Chayanov and all the Russian debate. It was a very strong debate around how you manage the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy, and also read Georgescu-Roegen later in the 60s and 70s. The economics of the peasant society was a key turning stone to understand the extent to which you can industrialize or not, based on the type of changes in exactly this redistribution of rents along this agricultural supply chain, if we want to use a modern language, right? And so how the institution can create this mechanism to stabilize prices, but in doing that to redistribute, right? Sort of industrial agricultural policy. So I wanted to hear a bit more on that because in a sense, I think this is, there is an element of how you understand China's approach as a stabilizer of prices, or how we understand more as an active way of shaping the market, using basically prices as a way of creating imbalances, right? Using Alice Amsterd's expression of fixing the price wrong, so that actually you advantage certain groups in a certain moment, and now you disadvantage other in another to facilitate this learning dynamic. In the same way, this relationship between the backward industry, the more industrial, the steel and of this world, this was adopted in many European countries as well under planning, right? In my own country, in Italy, the cathedral in the desert, as they were called later in the south, like the biggest steel plant in all Europe, Ilva, was built to subsidize machine production and automotive in the north, right? So this idea of using pricing really as a strategy for industrialization and redistribution of rents seems to be the cross-cutting element between all these different sectors. And what I'm trying to figure out is, as you said, the risk of unproductive rent capture is always there, both in the US system and in the big push one. So how do you see that being managed, right? It was an institutional design that was making this possible, or was more a real political economy or political settlement configuration, which made some of these institutional tools, the how you are talking about, really feasible in that context? Because, if we, in Africa today, in many countries, I work a lot in Tanzania and so on, they've been trying all these things, right? Why they cannot reproduce the same, even when they set up the right type of institutions, right? Why is that these are so difficult to to grasp. And yes, no, I'll stop there because otherwise I'll go too far. But these are three key questions that really at least struck me from the richness of the material and points you raised in your presentation. So thanks so much for that. Olga, before we open the floor, you have also time for a few points, comments.
Thank you, but perhaps Isabella might like to answer to yours, because
yeah. Isabella, you decide if you want to already engage with them or you need a bit of time to think through while Olga comes in.
I'll let you speak, Olga, please.
All right, thank you. Mine are more broader types of questions, and well, it's a fascinating read. Thank you very much. I really got my book copy of the book, and also amazing preface. Yes, I also grew up in the 90s, but on the precisely the other side of the fence. And the questions you are describing, you were asking yourself, were also inspired my research in the PhD, but I looked at the Asian tigers. And let me start perhaps with a kind of technical question. You use the policy activism as a term throughout the book. And I wonder whether it was a conscious choice. I mean, now there is also some literature on developmental states. Now they're trying to rephrase it to state activism to kind of escape the narrow interpretation of developmental state. Whether do you refrain from using, let's say, state capitalism or state activism by choice, or was it just that you just felt more comfortable with that term, policy activism? The second question I had, it's about the bureaucracy of things. You refer to Wang Angshi, a very influential thinker, reformer, and in that in his text, Memorial of a Myriad Words, or depending on translation perhaps, he refers to the ancient government as a method and ideas. And then he says, the greatest need of the time is the securing of capable officials. So obviously that idea of statesmen running all under the heaven, right? That civilization state was always there, and China has been very particular in solving that question, right? So I wonder if, whether you think that the way of organizing that bureaucracy, and there are also intellectuals within bureaucracy, right? So whether that also that important variable of defining variable of policy activism, right? Not only obviously in the reform years that you describe in the book, but if we look at those, legacies, very of ancient type, because in that same text, he also goes to say that the problems of the times are different, and we don't need to replicate what the ancient government or statesman did, but we only need to apply to their principles. And this is that situational thinking that is there, and that I think you refer in the book, right? That you adapt to the context, and this is absolutely fundamental. So I wonder if there are traces of that adaptability that also can be traced in the bureaucratic structures. And I wonder if that is something that you think is kind of worth exploring in a way. Another question I had, is about Taiwan. It's there, and the price, the fear of inflation was absolutely fundamental to their course of economic reform, particularly to the finance. There was a very, despite quite interventionist policies, but Taiwanese, there was a quite stable consensus among financial policy elites and institutions like central bank, ministries, how they coordinated and how gradually they liberalized. So I wonder, vis-a-vis, for example, Korea, very, very typical comparison. So I wonder whether, Formosa or Taiwan was something there in the picture that, Chinese intellectuals as well look looked up, or what was the intellectual exchange there? And perhaps the last question, comparing with Russia in 90s and 80s, that this is so relevant, and Eastern Europe in general, I would say, right? You know, maybe the kind of the curse is that Russia is too close to the Western intellectual cultural space, and in a way that very radical and kind of brutal Westernization started already in 1700s, and that was the kind of the starting point. Rather than China, it looks like the legacy of the internal context-dependent domestic intellectual tradition goes back, you know, again from all under the heaven, you know, the statecraft also perhaps enabled that conversation. And therefore, I also wonder if there is something in, if we were to go a little bit backward and look at the Westernization type of ideas before 1980s, is there could it be a useful exercise as well to trace in China, I mean, right? Yeah, that would be my 4 questions. It's a very interesting read. I really encourage everyone to get the book. Thank you very much for presentation today, Isabella.
Thanks, Olga. Isabella, you have quite a few things now to go through for another entire talk, but feel free to select those that you feel more relevant that you want to address, and then we open the space. There are already a couple of questions for both.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. These are all amazing questions, and kind of point to all the things that one could develop out of the book. So this is very, very helpful in trying to think how to take this to the next level. Thank you so much. In terms of the notion of markets, I think there's something that I haven't emphasized in the presentation, basically due to time limitations, which is the whole idea of the law of value, right? I mean, of course, by the late 1970s, there's still a strong reference to Marxist economics. And there's one interpretation of the law of value that emphasizes basically exchange values and the fluctuation of market prices around production prices as the regulating mechanism to bring prices to their value, right? So there's certainly one way of thinking about markets that comes from this Marxist classical political economy kind of tradition that is, of course, quite distinct from the Hayekian subjective value theory kind of way of thinking about markets. I think that Deng Xiaoping himself was not someone who primarily was concerned with the right interpretation of Marx's law of value. I think he came at this from a much more pragmatist, and I know pragmatism is a very overused word in relation to China, but nevertheless, I think he really comes at this from a very hands-on perspective, from the perspective of how markets have been used in the economic warfare, but also in the early period of after the revolution, and in the period after the Great Leap Forward and the disasters of the Great Leap Forward, when there was a big retracting from very ambitious collectivization and all of that, and a move back to agricultural markets. So I think he's coming at it more from this very empirical perspective, where markets are not some abstract price signals that require complete markets and complete price vectors and all of that, but where markets are institutions that are really, I mean, a tractable part of the rural economy, right? As very local, clearly defined institutions. In terms of the question of stabilizing prices versus shaping markets, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've emphasized the price stabilizing mechanism because I think this is like the easiest way to grasp the logic of the ever normal granary. And by the way, the US during the New Deal also replicated some of these techniques, but that's just a footnote. But of course, in the logic of the ever normal granary, and even if you read these traditional statecraft texts, there is a an explicit acknowledgement that by shaping prices, you basically shape the relationship between peasants and the urban economy. So if agricultural prices are too high, then you are harming the urban economy. If prices are too low, then you're harming the rural economy. So you always want to shape this in a way that creates stability. But then in the context of industrialization, this of course goes beyond stability. And in fact, the whole question of the price scissors has been one that is a continuous issue throughout throughout post-revolution history in China. And in fact, the agricultural reforms, not least, are also helped by an adjustment of the price of grain upwards, so that the redistribution is less immediate. I mean, there's still redistribution happening, but it's less severe. And the whole, throughout really the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there is an acknowledgement that as long as China is a more or less closed economy and you need a fund for industrialization, then this fund for industrialization is ultimately coming from the agricultural economy, right? So there's this whole idea, this whole issue of, on the one hand, having the peasants as the most important revolutionary subject, and on the other hand, squeezing the peasants to the edge in order to fund industrialization, right? So I think this redistributive problem is also why the breakthrough in agricultural productivity in the early years of reform is so important, because this creates a space in terms of an agricultural surplus to actually then also take industry onto a certain growth trajectory. Now, of course, another thing that follows from not implementing a big bang and remaining techniques of price adjustment of important prices. It's not the case that the Chinese state controls the prices for lollipops, right? They couldn't care less. But the price for steel or electricity, for example, and as a matter of fact, just today, in case you opened the Financial Times, one of the headlines was that China just sent the commodity prices back down because they announced that they are going to take action to control the rapidly increasing commodity prices for steel, copper, and so on, right? Which they have the capacity to do because they have built this capacity since the 80s in a very systematic fashion. And this, of course, has to do with redistribution across sectors, and therefore like a way to encourage industrialization, not only through direct subsidies, but also through providing, for example, cheap steel and thereby cross-subsidizing machine production and all of that, right? So this is absolutely crucial to understanding the Chinese industrialization approach. In terms of the bureaucracy, so we have to, of course, remember that during the Cultural Revolution, there was a pretty wholesale onslaught on the bureaucracy, right? The slogan of bombarding the headquarters can, of course, be taken out of context and create a possibly misleading impression in the context of Western Maoism. But still, there were these slogans, right? And there was an onslaught on the professional bureaucracy. Economists were sent to the countries that are sent to labor camps as part of this onslaught on technical expertise, right? So the whole project of putting economics in command and elevating the economic development or the development of the forces of production, if you want to use the Marxist terminology, as opposed to the relations of production, was premised on the idea of recreating a professional bureaucracy, right? So this was really, the opening of university entrance exams instead of selecting students based on political criteria, and all of that was all part of recreating expertise in a technical sense, as opposed to political commitment or mass movement type of approaches. Can we draw a straight line to the traditional ideas of bureaucracy? Probably not. Can we see that reformers did take inspiration from traditional statecraft, I think absolutely. I mean, when we talk about economics in the West, we go back to Adam Smith, consciously or not, right? So why would Chinese thinkers thinking about these fundamental problems, for which there have been centuries of texts and practices and thoughts, why would they not take this into account, right? Of course they are, whether explicitly or not. Sometimes it's also just a subtext of the way in which you're thinking about organizing institutions. I think you're absolutely right, Olga, that the question of Westernization and how Westernization came about or came not about and has been debated in the 19th or even 18th century is really important and is a very, very interesting field of research. Of course, in China, there have been reform movements prominently in the late 19th century, but then also, of course, around the revolution in 1911 and so on. So that there are historical cases that are really important to connect to the 1980s debates. And maybe just as a shout out, Rebecca Karl has written a book which is called Magic of Concepts that links the 1920s and 1930s to the 1980s debates on a somewhat more abstract level than what I'm doing. But nevertheless, I think that is a great starting point to make these connections. In terms of policy activism versus state activism or state capitalism. So what I've tried to do in the book is to not foreground big labels, but to try to kind of inductively, with a very clear research question, which is how have Chinese economists thought about creating markets in the context of a planned command economy? How have they thought about it? What kind of distinctions can we trace, and how do they relate to Chinese state market relations subsequently? So this has been really my question, more than can we now give this a label of state capitalism? Can we give this a label of neoliberalism? Can we give this a label of state activism versus policy activism? So I'm not saying that these distinctions are not important, but my feeling is that a lot of the literature on China has been predominantly guided by these questions of, is China imperialist? Is China capitalist? Is China neoliberal? And what I'm trying to do in my work is to, instead of trying to put China as a whole into one box, try to understand, how did capitalism, how did neoliberalism, how did even Keynesianism become relevant to China's own economic policy making, and what kind of role did it play? And then what are the fractions within China? Who are the neoliberals? Who are the people who are opposing neoliberalism? And what kind of amalgamation is emerging from that, instead of simply taking big categories and projecting them on the Chinese case?
Thanks, Isabella. Thanks a lot. I think you managed to cover almost everything, which was quite miraculous, considering how many questions we got. So I have already 2 questions here. We have from Fidel Mbele and from Giorgos Galanis. I will allow them to talk so that they can ask the question directly. So Fidel, would you like to be the first one to go?
Yes, can you hear me?
Very well, please.
Yes, so my question is, so China, I think the Communist Party made it a point that by 2025, they want to move, they want to convert their economy from a labor-intensive economy to a capital-intensive economy. So what you saw during the Trump years was basically an attempt to block that through intellectual property rights, basically blocking the transfer of technologies to China. So to what extent do you think that is still happening, or how much of that is influencing what the stance is towards China? Because they do seem set to become a capital-intensive economy, basically moving all the labor-intensive stuff to Cambodia, to Laos, and all the other countries, so that they can move into a more capital-intensive form of economy.
Thanks, Fidel. Isabella, would you like to address directly, or like collect another question, as you prefer?
Sure. So that's a great question. It prompts me to maybe bridge a little bit between the 80s and today. So one aspect that I didn't have time to go into it all. It's the whole question of the so-called coastal development strategy. So part of the very strong upward pressure on upstream industries was, of course, that there was a lack of these crucial inputs for industrialization, right? So there was a need to further build up the core industrial sectors. Now, the big question was, how would you finance that, right? And one way of financing that was to very consciously recognize and basically use the method that also other Eastern tigers have pursued, to recognize that China's comparative advantage lies in cheap labor, but that not cheap labor alone is enough, right? But that by having good infrastructure and all of that, you can basically export cheap labor and re-import technology and means to upgrade your industries. So I think this is important to recognize that the export-led orientation that in the early years very strongly relied on China's cheap, disciplined, skilled labor force was always with an eye to the industrialization project more broadly, right? This was not seen as an aim in itself. So the question of technology transfers and the shift to a more capital intensive or technology intensive or also more domestic demand-led economy is kind of trying to move out of this model into the next stage of development, right? And as the way that I see it is that as long as China focus on exporting cheap labor, that was quite compatible with the project of most multinational enterprises globally, right? Because they benefited hugely from very cheap, very disciplined, very reliable labor forces that enabled them to extract very high profits. But the situation becomes much more contentious when China moves from being the proverbial workshop of the world to trying to build its own industries and its own companies that eventually can compete with the companies that still continue to be very, very predominantly headquartered in the UK, the EU, and the US, right? So I think that Huawei and the whole conflict around Huawei is kind of the encapsulation of this problem, in the sense that this was the first time that a Chinese company reached the technological frontier in a technology that is absolutely essential for infrastructure as part of the fourth industrial revolution, right? So in that sense, it's not simply about Huawei or simply about what exactly the CEO of Huawei said or didn't say or all of that, right? It's really about this pretty objective conflict that for the first time, China has produced a company that reaches that point. And that had not happened before, right? And with the whole discussion around computer chips and the latest developments in that realm, we can see how China is still very heavily dependent on foreign technology in so many fields, right? So it's really, I mean, Huawei is really a unicorn, but so the point, I mean, the mounting of tensions at that point when it becomes clear, okay, China is at the brink of becoming competitive in important industries, but it's not quite there yet, right? I think this is kind of the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think this is kind of the big context for why we see these mounting tensions. Of course, only looking from a purely economic point of view, there's also geostrategic and political issues and all of that. But just from a point of view of industrialization and the economics of it.
By the way, this opens a completely also very interesting story around what's happening in the US in the context of, as you were saying, stopping certain type of companies, but also not realizing that the capacity of Huawei to take the leadership has been happening alongside Cisco and other companies, which used to be the leader, becoming extremely financialized, so not doing any more their own job, right? So there is an element of even corporate governance comparability and differences that makes the story at a different level, right? More interesting, right? How the Chinese government has managed to nurture national champions who operate in the global space with a retain, reinvest type of attitude more than as a cash cows for a stock market that is largely predatory in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, of course, as Mariana Mazzucato has shown abundantly, it's not like it's uniquely Chinese to have that strong state backing of companies, especially in the early stages, right? So therefore, I'm not so convinced that the problem here is China's active state. I think it's really more about competitiveness than about the size or specific kind of participation of the state.
Yeah. Okay, Yorgos, I'm inviting you to the podium, to the panel to raise your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Isabella, for the very nice presentation and for the book, which I have ordered. I haven't read it yet. I was thinking to what extent we can generalize the experience of China to other developing but also developed countries, given two things. One, the fact that it moved from a kind of planned economy, not a kind of a planned economy, to a kind of a market economy. So given the specific trajectory that was there, and also given the level of development, and I'm thinking more specifically, so there are in a way two processes, right? There is one, marketization, or opening up of the market, but with very specific and in a way, how can I put it, steps, very subtle, if you want, steps towards controlling prices and also protecting a number of industries, etc. So while at the same time reducing inequality. So is there kind of a generalization that we can think of, or because of the very specific circumstances, there's not much extent that we can generalize? Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Yorgos. This is a great question. I mean, I think there are basically two contradictory lessons. One lesson is that there is no magic bullet. So there's no one big model that you can just extract and then copy and then apply, and then it will solve it all, right? So there is no, I think the Chinese case in some sense shows that there's no big one blueprint for development that can do it all. At the same time, I think one big implication of this is that the Washington Consensus is also not that big blueprint that could do it all, right? So this is in some sense a negative lesson. But as a result of that, I think there are some commonalities with the Eastern Tiger type of trajectory, in the sense that it is clear that if you come from a position of underdevelopment, however you want to call it, or lack of industrialization, lack of industrial competitiveness, that it's virtually impossible to move up without a very strong state. But the question is what exactly the state is doing. There might not be like one solution. I've actually come to think of it more as some sort of a guerrilla type of strategy, where it's not like you have one blueprint with the tactics for how to win the war of development, but where it's really about understanding your specific position in the global economy and trying to very strategically poke holes into places where you can poke holes into, which requires a lot of careful on-the-ground research of specific sectors, a lot of very tedious analysis of existing institutions, and taking that as starting point to see where your best bet is. So in that sense, just like in guerrilla warfare, kind of taking the superior knowledge of the local conditions as the one advantage that you have, and try to take it from there. But then in order to exploit such advantages strategically, I think a strong state is basically virtually a necessary condition. Yeah. but I mean, I think it's important to see that there's not the Beijing consensus that is like one model that emerges that can be transferred. And of course, it's historically contingent in terms of the planned economy and all of that, but other development stories are also historically contingent, right? I mean, the fact that Taiwan and Korea and Japan were American allies in the context of the Cold War is obviously pretty big historical contingency in terms of the historical starting point. So that brings me back to this point of guerrilla warfare, where it's really about assessing the concrete conditions and then studying the experiences of other countries, not to copy them, but to understand certain possible mechanisms of poking holes into this structure that really is designed to keep developing countries down, right?
Thanks, Isabella. I don't see any other question at the moment. So maybe, Olga, if you have a further follow-up, you're welcome to raise it at this point.
It was more about the Taiwanese, whether there was any intellectual exchanges there, and it's kind of what I traced, that the debate, even among the tigers, there was still two strategies: either you prioritize growth or you go for growth with distribution, which is even more difficult. And the Taiwanese opted for the second one because of that fundamental existential fear of inflation, of what happened in the mainland. So I'm just curious whether that was, and there weren't any exchanges there.
Yeah, so let me preface what I'm saying by I'm not a scholar of Taiwan, and I should probably know more about Taiwan than I do. It makes perfect sense to me that in Taiwan there would have been an extensive fear of inflation, because at the end of the day, the nationalists, I mean, they lost the Civil War for many reasons, but not being able to bring very severe, I mean, one of the most extensive periods of hyperinflation in 20th century under control was, of course, a big element of that, right? So the fear of inflation would have been ingrained in the mentality of economic policymakers, I think, in a very substantial way, as it is, by the way, in Germany, right, where we have this fear, very deep fear of inflation and this historical precedence and all of that. So I think this is not to be underestimated in terms of the psychology that I think plays an important role in when it comes to calling the shots, what you prioritize, right? Now, where the exchanges, yes, there were exchanges, but these exchanges were not as prominent, basically. I mean, they were happening typically in Hong Kong from what I've seen, but they were not as prominent, basically due to political reasons. But someone like, say, Gregory Chow, who traveled to China and advised the Chinese government on economics curriculum reform, also advised the Taiwanese government at some point. So there were certainly people who were involved on both sides. And there was certainly an examination of what was happening in Taiwan. Yeah, so I would say this is an excellent question, something that I probably should have gone more to in the book. There's only so much one can do. I think it would be a great paper to write, to look into this more carefully. I have a number of resources that I have collected in the process, but I didn't get a chance to develop in more detail in the book.
Thanks. Jose, you wanted to Jose Coronado, add some comments in relation to this issue of the inflation that you put in the Q&A.
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you for the presentation. I look very much forward for the book. But just following up on what Yorgos was saying, in terms of this being like a development strategy for, thinking in terms of development strategies for developing economies, price controls have been heavily criticized in Latin America, particularly a region that is very much afraid of inflation and has this inflation paranoia because of the history of the mid-20th century, right? Based on, and the argument goes that it could generate inflationary pressures, but at the same time, sort of like curtailed by the fact that you have, a globalized market for, agricultural produces. So I'm wondering a little bit. It makes me think a little bit about, the role of this sort of like international flows of commodity exchanges, and what sort of like repercussions could they have in a system in a system of prices that you described?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Jose. It's great to see friends like Yorgos and Jose here on the call. So let me this is a great entry point to make one distinction that I did not get into in the talk. So in the book, I also talk about price controls during World War II, right? And I think it's important to recognize that there are different kinds of ways of controlling price through the state. So one way is to simply say, okay, these are the prices that now have to prevail on the market, right? Which is basically ordering price controls. Another way is to say, this is our target price, and now we use state commerce to actually adjust supply and demand in ways that we more or less hit that target price, which is a very different logic from commanding a price to be in place, right? Now, this second logic of using state commerce and buffer stocks to stabilize prices for important commodities, I think is very prevalent in the Chinese case, and is something that, of course, has also come up in the immediate post-war period, not least with proposals by Keynes and Kaldor, with the idea of having international commodity buffer stocks, right, that would enable especially smaller, poor countries that are dependent on the export of raw materials and agricultural commodities to not be subject to violent price fluctuations, which if half of your basket of exports is dependent on, it's basically composed of one commodity, then if this commodity price changes, that basically has huge implications for your macroeconomy, right? So this idea actually can be linked, I think, to the ideas of the ever-normal granary, not only logically, but also historically. And in many ways, China is still doing something along these lines for important commodities. So China, for example, for grain, still has the largest stockpile by a far margin in terms of public storage for grain, which means that they have their own buffer stock, which enables them to buffer price fluctuations in, for example, grain, which was something that actually became important last year in the context of the shutdowns, when you needed to ensure, if you had as severe shutdowns as they had, you needed to ensure food provisioning, right? And you needed to ensure that food shortages would not result in rapid increases in food prices. So in that context, these kind of storage mechanisms and the ability of the Chinese state to create markets very quickly actually became quite important. So I think in that sense, the Chinese practice, might be contingent on the size of the Chinese economy to some extent, but at the same time does illustrate that the idea of the state, quote unquote, manipulating prices through mechanisms such as buffer stocks might actually not be a bad idea, especially if you are a poor country where typically a smaller number of commodities make up a much larger share of both your producer as well as your consumer price index, right? The more the more developed the economy, the more diverse your consumption basket, the more diverse your production portfolio, the more diverse the kind of commodities that are involved. But if you are poor, typically that is, the shares of some basic commodities in all these indexes are very big. So in that sense, I think the Chinese development model might give some credit to reviving some of these post-war proposals for buffer stocks and the stabilization of commodity prices as a precondition for development, also possibly in Latin America. And interestingly, in the most recent Biden executive order on resilient supply chains, they actually have started to talk about buffer stocks again, but for the US, not for Latin America. I should stop here and not say more on that.